I don't know about you, but our family's already begun to practice our holiday traditions. We've begun to go to Kozer Christmas Village and the various things that we like to do every year. Our Christmas tree is in the living room, and inside the house is decorated. I've wrestled a few times already with the strings of outdoor lights. And this time of the year, we find ourselves reminded of hope, of peace, of joy, love, and of the story of Jesus. And a season full of bright colors actually has another darker side to it, though, the one that we don't like to talk about, the one that we like to smile to hide. It is a season that can be also full of much sadness, family tension as we gather, loneliness, painful reminders of the loved ones that we are missing or have lost. These things sometimes can prevent us from enjoying that perfect picture of Christmas that we have and that is sold to us through the stories of books and Lifetime movies. I am, by the way, a fan of those cheesy Lifetime movies. Others of us may be wrestling with seasonal depression or obstacles in our life that seem to just steal the magic of the season. However, even in these tense and painful moments, as we enter the Advent season, it is important to remind ourselves of how just Jesus brought hope, peace, joy, and love within our reach. This morning we begin our Advent season within our reach, and our Advent season with the series Within Our Reach. And through this series, we desire to enter the Christmas story, to be reminded of how Jesus brought to us these things, how he brought to humanity hope and peace and joy and love. Within Our Reach is our 5-week journey of rediscovering how Jesus brought hope, peace, joy, and love within our reach through the story of Christmas. And we also look at it to learn what the implications are of that reality for our lives. Christmas is a season of remembering this powerful story, no matter where we are at. As Katrina said earlier, the word behind the Latin word behind this word Advent means the coming. If we just simply literally translate it, it means the coming. However, Stephen Beale, a Catholic professor of Latin, says this: the word Advent, which we translate as the coming, might have a deeper meaning. Adventus is a form of the verb adventio, which is not only to arrive, to come to, but also as develop, set in, and arise. Adventus itself also refers to an invasion, an incursion, a ripening, and an appearance. All detonations that are rich with implications for the gospel accounts of Christ. The word describing Advent could also describe the way the presence of Jesus through the Christmas story invades our reality and our world. As Katrina read earlier, when some teachers of the law asked Jesus when the kingdom of God would finally come, when will you bring that thing we are expecting? When will you show up the way we expected you to? Jesus replies, coming of the kingdom is not something that can be observed. In other words, it can't be touched. You won't see it. It's not like I'm going to just build a castle out there. You're not going to say, there it is, here it is, because in all honesty, already, the kingdom of God is in your midst. It came with my birth. Likewise, we'll see through this series what it means to have and to experience and to be transformed by an invasion of hope, joy, peace, and love. We could say that Advent in many ways is a season of expectation and anticipation. We have many traditions that we practice throughout December, both in expectation and anticipation of Christmas Day. And in fact, I don't think there's any holiday that we celebrate this far out from the actual day in the same way that we do with Christmas. This idea of celebrating Christmas for the whole month has more to do with the church than it does in the marketplace. Now, we know as we look and we see that even before Halloween, Christmas is in the stores, that the original concept behind Christmas, behind Advent, as it was supposed to take up the whole month. And that has been hijacked by stores, but it has its origins in the church. the month leading up to Christmas in the early church was known as Advent, and it was used by the church to remember that anticipation and that expectation felt by the Jewish people as they longed, as they waited for their Messiah to fulfill his promises of hope, peace, joy, and love. For centuries, prophets would continually remind them of God's heart and promises. The prophets were giving his people hope, focusing them forward, waiting for this time. Advent is a season for us, too, to remember that sense of anticipation and expectation. You know, throughout time, often that sense of waiting for Jesus was referred to as the birthing pains, that it was used to explain the tension they felt as they waited for their Messiah to come with answer and with provision. The weeks leading up to Christmas makes us realize as we look at it what we would not have if it weren't for Jesus. And Christmas Day, this magnificent day of celebration and triumph that really explodes and takes over our neighborhoods and our families with joy and color, that day is when the birthing pains come to an end, and a virgin mother literally gives birth to a boy she names Jesus, a boy that was both the physical and figurative representation of everything those prophets had been promising for years. Dan Wilt writes, in the early centuries of the church, it became clear that the rhythms of time, days, weeks, and years, and lifetimes could be used to help Christians remember and reclaim the saving events of Jesus' life. Now, I'm not sure where you're at as you're entering the Advent season. Maybe you are feeling the joy, the colors, the warmth, or maybe you are feeling something a little darker. Maybe you are struggling and wrestling to get into the season. Not sure what problems and what pain you carry. However, I do know that personally, and through also the story of the Scriptures, as it tells the story of Christmas, God's presence is very much within your reach. God's presence is within your reach. In his love, he's pursuing you with his hope, his peace, his joy, and love. Even as we sit here, Jesus is near you right this very moment and throughout the season, and he promises to be with you wherever you go. Through the Christmas season on Sunday mornings, we are going to walk the path leading up to the Christmas story. We are going to witness just how Jesus brought these things within our reach. And this morning, we are going to read this very idea of expectation and anticipation from Isaiah. And it begins to, these ideas of expectation and anticipation actually begin to define Jesus' birth hundreds, 1,000 years before the arrival of Jesus. We see it in form around a prophecy with the prophet Isaiah, and it was an announcement of hope. Isaiah gives his people, his countrymen, those who are looking for hope in Messiah, this glimpse of what's to happen. We're going to find that in Isaiah 9, 2 through 7. Now, before we read that, let me just point out a few things. Isaiah, this prophet, this prince of prophets who's known for his prophecies, was actually born into Israel during a time of great prosperity. We might even say that Israel felt great again. There certainly was the normal pains and problems of life and the ups and downs of the economy, but overall, life was abundantly full of provision. The government of Israel, though, was always keeping an eye on this northern country that was always threatening violence and enslavement. See what I did there? Right? It's not much different. We live in a time of abundance. We want to make America feel great again. There's these normal pains and problems of life, but overall, if we'd stop and really analyze things, yes, the economy does this, but just like the time that Isaiah was born into, overall, we have been provided for pretty well, right? Sure, we're keeping our eyes to the country in the north, right? North Korea, we're never sure what they're doing, but overall, life is pretty well. However, it's in times of comfort, and this is what happens to Israel. In times of comfort, people tend to take their eyes off God as the source of everything. Israel was no different. Sure, culturally, they lived by the Torah. They confessed the words of the Torah, the law, but they didn't have their hearts turned to God in full surrender. But Isaiah, this prophet, continues to relay messages from God time and time again, calling God's people to come back to him. Isaiah saw the people were not listening, and he was obviously fearing that they never will. He lamented that he was afraid his people were too far gone. Regardless, Isaiah knows for sure that regardless of his people, he knows that he has experienced the presence of the living God. And he knows the words that he is speaking, the things that he has seen in vision and spoken out prophetically will come true. And so he seals them up and holds his prophecies for the future so that people will understand things when it happens. For some reason in his time, God's people in their comfort got in their idea that, you know what, there are answers that could be found in places that weren't God-centered. In fact, if we'd read the chapters before this one in Isaiah, we'd see that God's people had actually started thinking that the dead had more answers than the living. They began to seek their dead relatives, who were now eternally rested in Sheol, and they believed that they had answers for the living that the living didn't have access to. So they began to mess with magic, mediums, divination, and mystic sources. They began to find ways as a community, even as individuals, to call up the dead and talk to them. And Isaiah called them out. He says, "Why do you look for the ghosts that whisper and when God is really there and will speak to you?" This was especially true when they were dealing with financial trouble, or they needed advice for pains that they were experiencing or illnesses. They would look to the dead for answers. The iconic part is the more that they pursued this detour from God at the center, the more that they walked away from seeing God as the source of answers. We learn through Isaiah's prophecies that the people felt as if they were without hope. People had begun to really think that there was no hope to be found in anywhere. And so, if anything, maybe we need to have hope that there will be a new government. They began to think that they had experienced darkness or were defeated by oppression, and so they began to have these rumors, these ideas that, hey, as long as we have a new birth in the lineage of the king, maybe something new will happen. They began to look for the birth of a new son in the royal household as a sign of hope. People had walked away from God at the center. They turned their hope, not to God, but to the government. The Moody commentary says this: ultimately, their dire situation will lead them to curse their God and their king, having put their trust in something other than God. They will find no solace in the world, no mechanism through which the distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish may be lifted, and no hope for anything but continued suffering. It was a time, even though they were prosperous, that was void of hope. So God's people begin to look for this birth, this lineage that will set everything right. And during that time, God was beginning to also relay his plan of hope through Isaiah, his fulfillment of his promise for his people. And in this passage and in the rest of Isaiah 9, we see Isaiah doing two things. He's foretelling and forthtelling, right? He's telling them what they're doing wrong. He's being forthright with them. He's forthtelling them. You guys need to stop listening to ghosts. You know the guy that created humanity. At the same time, he begins to tell them what is happening in the future. Listen up. The hope is this, right? This is what God is going to do. Think about that as we read this passage this morning, Isaiah 9, 2 through 7. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Now, interesting there, he's playing on his earlier passage where people were walking in darkness looking for answers among the dead. They were looking for answers in the darkness, but he's now saying that there are some people who are walking in darkness that have seen a great light. Those who are walking in darkness or in judgment, he says prophetically, will also see a great light, right? On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. There's hope. You have enlarged the nation, increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment that is rolled in blood will now be destined for burning, and will be fuel for the fire. For us a child is born. To us a son is given. Now, he's seeing this prophetically in the future, but speaking as if it is now, right? And the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatest of this government and peace there will be no end. Now, wonderful counseling there isn't what you and I think of a counselor, right? It's not somebody helping you decide what college class to take. It's not somebody that's sitting with you as you're struggling with your marriage. The word for counselor there actually incorporated a Hebrew idea of this person who would walk with you, who would kind of relate to you. It actually incorporates the idea of these miraculous breakthroughs. Counselor, not as we think of in modern society, but one who advises, who serves as a consultant, and with it comes this idea of miraculousness. Now, there's another word there, mighty, and ironically, mighty there means victorious champion, right? But later Isaiah says Prince of Peace, so it feels kind of odd. And then there's this word everlasting, this eternal, right? And Isaiah goes on. He says, he will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Listen to how the Layman's Bible Commentary explains this passage. This is another case where, in retrospect, it becomes clear what Isaiah means in these prophecies, right? For us, on this side of the Christmas story, we get what he's saying. Yet for his original audience, Jews who are living in a time of prosperity, but seeking living among the dead for the answers for the living, yet for his original audience, Isaiah's words in verses 6 through 7 must have sounded too good to be true, and most likely confusing as well. The wonderful counselor is to be a descendant of Adam. He goes to Adam instead of David. He's also a mighty God and everlasting Father. But his other title, Prince of Peace, must have been puzzling in light of the war and destruction that Isaiah had been predicting. Clearly, Isaiah is bringing good news, yet it must have been a bit mystifying for his generation. As we look at this passage, one of the first things we see is that Isaiah begins to paint the story of the birth of Jesus to be one of rescue. Now, have you ever experienced hope in the middle of deep trouble? Have you felt you were rescued or that your need was provided for when you were longing for rescue or provision? 2010, you may recall the story, and the world's media sources looked on as 33 mine workers were trapped 2,300 feet under the earth, under the rock and soil in Chile. Over 130 people instantly began to work at an extravagant rescue plan, in which each attempt they found hiccups, including more cave-ins and trouble with equipment. It was about 2 months when the first mine worker was rescued. And during that time, the mine workers felt a mix of emotions. They were dreaming of ideas of rescue, of glimpses of hope, and in times which felt impossible. According to a CNN report, some of them probably had begun to doubt that rescue was possible. We could say hope felt void. Isaiah finds God's people receiving warning after warning of God. There are little cave-ins all over the place, and unfortunately, God's people aren't getting it. They look in every which way, but the right way for their answers. They have a mix of emotions, just like the mine workers. They know what God has promised, but they're looking for glimpses of hope in times that life felt impossible. Isaiah gave them a promise of a coming king that was to be born into the lineage of Adam. Wasn't he the problem with all of this originally? Isaiah's prophecy is delivered then with a warning of the current reality, sharing that troubles that wait for them, but it also paints a story of a birth of Messiah that shows God really longs to rescue his people. He loves his people despite their brokenness, and he longs to rescue them. God has a plan for hope. Second thing we see in this passage is that hope means the world has a promise. We could say that this prophecy from Isaiah is also a promise from God. Now, what is a promise? How would you define it? The dictionary says it's a declaration of something that will or will not be done. We certainly expect promises to be kept from our children. And God makes this promise to his children, that he will rescue his world and he will fulfill his promises. And though Israel has turned their back on God time and time again, God shows through Isaiah's prophecy that he very much still loves and cares for his children. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. Listen to these hopes. In the future, he will honor all nations, even those beyond the Jordan. Peace was coming, and every warrior's boot that was used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will now just be used as fuel for the fire. A new king will be born, a son of humanity. The leadership will be upheld by him for his people. He'll be miraculous. He'll be mighty. He'll be like an everlasting father. He'll be a prince that brings peace. And that sounded pretty exciting to them. In fact, because of his greatness, his leadership and peace would have no end. He will follow David's rule, and he will rule with even more justice and righteousness. In this passage, we get the glimpse that God is eager to fulfill his promise through his people. He's promising them that he will be present in every way, and we wish for, and every way that they wished for, right? Peace, hope, power. Yet his people had actually lost their eagerness for God to fulfill his promises. He was eager to fulfill his promise, but his people had lost their eagerness for him to do so. The hope comes true with the birth of Jesus hundreds of years later. The hope brought the presence of God in Jesus, which Jesus left us through the Holy Spirit. Jesus sets up his kingdom, a place where he reigns on this earth, and it's accumulating in power to its final day. We watch God keep his promise in the Christmas story, a promise he gave Isaiah. Christmas reminds us that God keeps his promises. It inspires hope, and it reminds us to be eager for God to fulfill his promises. God is very much the only source of hope, yet we always seem to find ourselves looking elsewhere, and it makes us wonder, do we really see God in this season as a source of hope? Are we eager for God's hope when it comes to being dependent on his timing and his ways? Right? Israel probably was eager for God to do something, but when it came to waiting for his time and ways, that's a whole nother story. This prophecy gave God's people hope. When it came true, we realized that hope means the world has a promise. We can know and trust that God will be true to what else he has promised for us, because he kept his promise for hundreds of years, from the story of Isaiah all the way up to the birth of Jesus. It also means hope means the world has a purpose. In this passage, Isaiah was given a great purpose. He was to share with God's people by communicating the promise of what God was doing. God's people find out that they are now actually central to the promise of God and the hope that he is bringing the world. There would be the light on the hill. There would be the holy nation. God will make himself known to the world, even to those nations beyond the Jordan, the Gentiles, through them. God expects them to share in his purpose. In this passage, Isaiah describes God's people of purpose like this. The people who were walking in darkness have now seen the light. They have found purpose in the light they have experienced. They have seen God's presence. The people who have experienced the light find that God has enlarged the nation, meaning he has promised fulfillment for more than just them. He has given purpose to the world, right? Those who are walking in darkness now see the light, and they see that God had intent for much bigger purpose. Those who experience the light and understand Isaiah's hopeful prophecy find that their joy is increased, it says, and their purpose also becomes one of rejoicing before God. As followers of Jesus, we find the hope we experience transforming in us. If we experience God's light, if it has transformed us, it gives us purpose. Purpose that goes deeper than our circumstances. It's a purpose that drives us to experience more of God's presence. If we have experienced God's light and it's kind of transformed us, it gives us purpose in our vision. We see that the reality is life is much bigger than just us, bigger than just our church, bigger than just our nation. We move from an inward to an outward focus. One of the biggest tests of someone who has been transformed by light is if they are more motivated motivated by caring for the inner than the outer. Early on, even in this Isaiah prophecy, we see, he says, those who have experienced the light see that one day God is going to do something bigger than just this nation. You have to be a part of it, but he's looking to bless those beyond the Jordan. The light transforms us in a way that moves us from what God is doing in the world, and it moves us to want to partner within him and in bringing hope to others through justice, through mercy, through compassion, and through the sharing of God's story. The light transforms us to be a people of rejoicing. In that way, we begin to experience God's light again. Lastly, hope means the world has a prayer. With Jesus came the hope that was prophesied hundreds of years before. Dan Wilt writes, when Jesus enters a room, hope enters a room. Sadly, too many followers of Jesus live in a fatalistic worldview. Life happens and you die. These are going to be all things, by the way, I've heard Christians say within the past year. The only thing that you can depend on is death and taxes. That's just the way the cookies crumble. Life's just unfair. He'll get his justice. Kill them all and let God sort them out. There's no hope for him or her or them. I'm too scared to go there or reach those people. I'm too scared of losing what I have, or I'm scared of what I have is changing. If we understand this story of Christmas, we should actually become the most hopeful people in the world, on the planet. We live in an already cynical world, a world looking for answers anywhere they can get them. We should look, smell, and appear so different. The world doesn't need more cynical people. Sadly, though, that's an image the neighborhoods have of churches. They are cynical people. The church doesn't survive with cynical people. Cynical people look inside when the story of Jesus drives us outside. Even Jesus, as he's dying, says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Israel saw through Isaiah God's promise. And what God was doing, Isaiah said that all people who experience God's light in the time that he saw will now stand, and we now stand on the other side of that hope. We stand and we should be praying for more hope for us and for others. We should be praying that we can be part of making God's hope known in the world because we've experienced it. We know its transformation, and we want others to experience it. We should be praying for the things God has still promised for us individually and through the Scriptures. Hope means the world has a prayer. It's not the world is on a wing in a prayer. There's actually real hope. We are witnesses to it. We've seen it unpacked through the story of Isaiah and then the birth of Jesus. We need to become people of hope. It's important that we discover through the Advent season how to move forward as messengers of God's hope. Now, in Christmas time, we remember the way God's hope invaded this world through the prophets and the birth of Jesus. And for generations, God's people have stood waiting with anticipation and expectation for God's hope. God kept his promise, and those willing to see it were transformed by their experience with God's hope and became God's hope to others. This morning, remember that Advent is a season of anticipation and expectation. Sure, we are all kind of looking forward to Christmas Day, for presents, for time with family. But more importantly, hopefully we are longing with anticipation and expectation for God to fulfill our lives as we grow with him.